Howdy, namaste, and welcome to Beyond Asana, Yoga, and Spirituality in the West. In today's podcast, we are going to be looking at BKS Iyengar and his book, Light on Life. But before we get into that, I would like to ask you to go beyond the podcast and come over to Instagram and join me at beyond.asana.podcast so we can hang out and get to know each other over there. And also, if you're interested in supporting the podcast and would like some extra content, you can check me out on Patreon. Those links will be in the show notes or the description if you're watching this on YouTube. So, with that being said, let's get into it. So for starters, I would like to give you some background information on BKS Iyengar. Because he is important to contemporary yoga, both in India and beyond. So not only did he help develop modern yoga, but he also helped bring it to the West. His book, Light on Life, The Yoga Journey to Wholeness, Inner Peace, and Ultimate Freedom, was published in 2005 and is meant to introduce a Western audience to some yogic philosophical ideas. The book is structured so that it introduces the reader both to the Vedantic concepts of the Koshas and to Patanjali's Yoga Sutras. Thus, Iyengar is exploring the ways in which yoga can make subtle shifts in your life as well as help you along your spiritual path. But before we get into that, let's take a look at Iyengar's biography. So if you happen to be watching this on YouTube, here is the cover of the book. So that is Iyengar there on the cover. So, Belur Krishnamachar Sundara Raja Iyengar was born in Belur, India on December 14th, 1918. Belur is in the southern Indian state of Karnataka. Subsequently, he passed away on August 20th, 2014 in Pune, Maharashtra, which is also in southern India. However, it is north of Karnataka. So this is the same city where Rajneesh had his ashram. However, I've not read anywhere that Rajneesh and Iyengar were really associated with one another. So you heard about Rajneesh if you listened to the last episode of the podcast. So Iyengar was the 11th of 13 children, and he was a sickly child. He contracted typhoid, malaria, and tuberculosis. So in 1934, at the age of 14, his brother-in-law, Krishnamacharya, the founder of modern yoga, asked Iyengar to travel to Mysore, Karnataka, to stay with his sister while Krishnamacharya traveled. And so Iyengar did go to stay with his sister. And upon his brother-in-law's return, he asked Iyengar to stay in Mysore and learn yoga, telling him that it could help Iyengar improve his health. And Iyengar did decide to stay and embrace yoga. He was often asked by Krishnamacharya to perform yoga demonstrations for the Maharaja. Krishna Raja Wadiyar IV, who was the patron of Krishnamacharya. So this means the Maharaja was funding Krishnamacharya and his yoga school. So we will look at Krishnamacharya more deeply in a future podcast as he is important to the development of modern yoga. However, I would be remiss if I didn't discuss Iyengar's recounts of his time with his brother-in-law. Iyengar has expressed some instances of abuse by Krishnamacharya. In particular, Iyengar recounts a time when Krishnamacharya asked him to perform Hanuman Asana, which is the splits. And I don't know about you all, I cannot do the splits. I've never been able to do the splits, even when I was a child. So it was a pose Iyengar hadn't accomplished either, but he forced himself into the position and did injure himself. So in Light on Life, he says, quote, "I pushed myself to the limits in my practice in order to do my duty to my teacher and guardian, and to satisfy his demanding expectations," end quote. At the age of 18, Iyengar was sent by Krishnamacharya to Pune to teach yoga. This was difficult for him as he did not speak the language or know anyone there. So if you're unfamiliar with India and India's history, there are many languages spoken in India. In Karnataka, they speak Kannada, while in Maharashtra, they speak Marathi historically, but today they also speak Hindi in Maharashtra. So these two languages are derived from different parent languages. Kannada is Dravidian, while Marathi and Hindi come from Indo-Aryan sources. Thus, they developed differently and use different alphabets. So there aren't many similarities between the two, right? When we think of other European languages and we speak English, like we have the word delicatessen, that's a German word. So we have these linguistic commonalities, right? And Marathi and Hindi have those linguistic similarities, but Kannada does not have that. So you're, a huge language barrier there. So Iyengar says when he left for Pune, he was experienced in asana or postural yoga, but not in pranayama or what is known as the breathing techniques. So by the 1960s, Iyengar's signature style had been established, and by this time, Europeans and Americans had begun to seek him out to study with him. Then in 1975, he established his principal school in Pune, which is called Ramamani Iyengar Memorial Yoga Institute, which is named after his late wife. And up until the pandemic, the school was still open. However, I looked at the website either yesterday or the day before yesterday, and they are still closed due to the situation. So I do hope at some point they reopen, because I think it would be a great historical loss for it to close permanently. So, from the information I could find, Iyengar first visited Europe in 1954, traveling to Switzerland on invitation by violinist Yehudi Menuhin. And Menuhin believed his yoga practice improved his violin playing. He even gave Iyengar a watch with an engraving that read, quote, "To my best violin teacher, BKS Iyengar," end quote. He then traveled to the United States in 1956, where he taught in Ann Arbor, Michigan, and he returned to Ann Arbor in 1973, 1974, and 1976. In 1966, Iyengar's book, Light on Yoga, which outlines his yoga methodology, was published. This was followed by the publication of 13 more books, including Light on Life. And through these books, his signature style of yoga and international travel, he has impacted many people's lives and given them the gift of yoga. Personally, I have never attended an Iyengar class. However, I want to share some of its signature qualities with you. And at some point, I'll make it to a class, hopefully. But it's something that I think is difficult to do via online, so things may need to open up a little bit more. So anyway, some of these signature qualities. The practice is known for its focus on body alignment in the asanas, sequencing poses, and the use of props for a period of time in order to perfect alignment. So while this might be the description of Iyengar Yoga one might find searching the web, Mary Dunn, the founder of Iyengar Yoga in America, states, quote, "People have incorrectly pigeonholed Iyengar Yoga into alignment techniques, props, rather than learning, experiencing, integrating, which I think are the real words, end quote. I think Light on Life backs up what Dunn is expressing here, especially integration, as the book focuses on integrating yoga, asana, pranayama, meditation, and philosophy into one's daily life instead of being a separate activity you just do a few times a week. So let's look at some specifics about Iyengar's style of yoga and getting certified to teach it. So getting certified to teach Iyengar yoga is a unique experience compared to other styles of yoga where you take an initial 200-hour yoga teacher training and go from there. According to the official website, BKS Iyengar Yoga, there are many levels of teacher training, which include Introductory 1 and 2, Junior Intermediate 1, 2, and 3, Senior Intermediate 1, 2, and 3, Junior Advanced 1, 2, and 3, and Senior Advanced 1 and 2. So to begin teacher training, one needs to have been a student of Iyengar Yoga for 3 years, attended 3 classes a week, and practiced daily on their own. And their teacher will judge if they are ready to start teaching or to start teacher training. The training lasts for at least 2 years, focusing on personal practice, acquiring clarity, and giving instructions, learning to make subtle adjustments with the use of props and understanding problems faced by specific individuals. After a year of training, the trainee can take the Introductory Level 1 exam. A year after that, they can take the Introductory Level 2 exam. And after that, they can apply for higher levels of certification with at least a year and a half gap between each level. So to my knowledge, this is the most intense yoga teacher training. I say that, however, now there are trainings to become a yoga therapist, and those trainings are much more involved as well, taking multiple years, as far as I'm aware. So now that we have some background information on Iyengar and his style of yoga, let's discuss the book. So as I stated at the beginning of this podcast, Iyengar structures the book... Oh no, I didn't say that. Did I? I don't think I did. Good stuff, good stuff. So Iyengar structures the book around the Kosha system, and this system comes from the Vedantic tradition. Iyengar was born to a Brahmin Vaishnavite family, which is under the umbrella of Vedanta. So Vedanta is one of the 6 schools of Hindu philosophy, and it translates as end of the Vedas. So the Vedas are the oldest surviving religious texts in the world. And the end of the Vedas refer to the Upanishads. The Upanishads are texts that specifically explore knowledge and liberation. So the Kosha system is set up to help you gain knowledge and provide a path to liberation. On the other hand, the book also discusses Patanjali's Yoga Sutras, and this is another path that is designed to help you gain knowledge and liberation. However, it is important to note that the Kosha system does not appear in the Yoga Sutras. So Iyengar is synthesizing 2 different paths to samadhi or enlightenment. So, the koshas. Koshas are energetic layers or sheaths that overlay the Atman, or your eternal non-changing core of your being. So one way to think about it is sort of like your soul, right? So the 5 layers are the Annamaya Kosha, the Pranamaya Kosha, the Manomaya Kosha, the Vijnanamaya Kosha, and the Anandamaya Kosha. So the Annamaya Kosha is the physical body, so this includes your skin, muscles, connective tissue, bones, and fat, and your physical senses, so sight, smell, touch, taste, and sound. The Pranamaya Kosha is your prana or subtle body, which is your life force energy. Sometimes it's directly interpreted as your breath, but it does control movements of breath, blood, lymphs, and cerebral spinal fluid. So in psychology terms, this is sort of controlling your bodily and spiritual rhythms and keeping them moving together. So the Manomaya Kosha deals with your mind, emotions, and nervous system. So you can kind of think of it as your control panel for the emotions and physical body, and it sends messages through the brain synapses and central nervous system, right? Because that's sort of how we feel emotions throughout parts of our body. So, this really deals with your brain, body, emotion connection. Then the Vijnanamaya Kosha is your wisdom body. So this deals with awareness, insight, consciousness, and it illuminates your deepest desires and allows you to see all the choices you have in all things and in all matters. So if you can get to this layer, you can really understand that you do have options and you do have choices. Obviously, I say that within reason. Obviously, that doesn't apply to somebody who's, imprisoned or being suppressed. So Anandamaya Kosha is the pure or radiant bliss body. So this state liberates you from suffering. If you can get down to this layer, this is where you can sort of start to become released from suffering. And once you sort of get through this layer, you reach the Atman. Now, I don't know if in this tradition you can actually reach the Atman. As you know, if you've listened to the other podcasts, I'm much more familiar with classical non-dual Shaiva Tantra, in which case, yes, you can reach, well, it's not known as the Atman in that system, but you can reach your innermost self, your awareness. So that is sort of an outline for that. So then he also discusses the Yoga Sutras, which are the 8 limbs of yoga, and in the book he actually refers to them as the 8 petals of yoga, which I don't know, maybe because I'm used to hearing them called limbs, which may or not be accurately describing them, although I think petals would have the same problems as limbs. I don't know, there's something about the word petals kind of drives me crazy, but whatever, it works. So in the Yoga Sutras, this also goes from like external to more internal. But there are the yamas, which are, maybe I have it marked in here. I have all these markings in the book. Aha, yes. The yamas are internal ethical observances. No, I'm lying to you. That's the niyamas. So they're ethical disciplines. The yamas are ethical disciplines. So, So the yamas include ahimsa, satya, asteya, brahmacharya, and aparigraha. I'll say it right. So ahimsa is non-harming, satya is truthfulness, asteya is non-stealing, brahmacharya is moderating the senses, and usually this revolves around the sexual senses, abstaining from sex, but also important to keep in mind that the Yoga Sutras were really written for ascetics to follow. So people that had left the context of the communal world and gone, say, to the forest, right? So aparigraha is non-possessiveness. So those are the yamas. And so the niyamas are Saucha, Santosha, Tapas, Svadhyaya, and Ishvara Pranidhana. So Saucha refers to cleanliness, both in your thoughts, in your body, and in your surroundings. Santosha is commitment. Tapas is self-discipline. Svadhyaya is self-study or self-reflection. This can also include reading scriptures. And Ishvara Pranidhana is surrendering to a higher power. So if you're someone who believes in God, that can be surrendering to God or whatever is the higher power in your spiritual tradition. Then there's asana, which are the postures, and in the Yoga Sutras, this only refers to seated postures. Pranayama, which is the restraint or expansion of breathing. Pratyahara, which is the withdrawal of the senses, so being able to, not focus on sights, sounds, tastes, smells, that kind of thing. Dharana, which is concentration. Dhyana, which is meditation. And Samadhi, which is complete integration. And so once you've reached Samadhi, I guess it depends on what tradition you're working with, right? But Samadhi could also be what more people have probably heard of, which is Nirvana. So you can still be, well, again, depends on the tradition, but you can still be completely integrated and still be alive and breathing and chatting with people. But I would also like to say that most often, whenever we're practicing meditation today, most of us are really practicing dharana, where we're trying to focus our concentration on a single point, which in modern Western meditation is often referred to as an anchor point. So you may be asked to focus on your breath, and if your mind wanders off, to bring your mind back to your breath, or even your senses sometimes are used in this. So what do you hear, right? Or what can you feel? Like on your skin or whatever, those types of things. So most of us, when we're practicing meditation, we're actually practicing dharana. But according to the Yoga Sutras, you have to sort of get through all these other layers in order to reach a state where you can fully practice meditation. So that's exciting. And I do have some tea today. I'm very excited. It's my favorite. And it is yogi tea. I don't know if you can see that. So it says, the brightness of your being is generated from within. I think Iyengar and Patanjali would agree with that. All right, let's see where I have this tab. All right, so now that we've sort of covered that stuff, and Iyengar covers that stuff in the first chapter of the book, which is just called it's called The Journey, no, I can't read, The Inward Journey. Chapter 1 is called The Inward Journey, and he talks about the different layers of the Koshas, and he gives an overview of the Yoga Sutras. Then in chapter 2, it's titled Stability, the Physical Body. So he's lining this up both with the Annamaya Kosha and Asana. So he pretty much follows the Koshas, but the Yoga Sutras, he doesn't talk about them in the order that I just presented them, which is the order Patanjali puts them in. So, here on the first page, one thing that I highlighted when I read this was, to be spiritual, one must not deny or forget the body. Throughout the journey to the spiritual goal, the body must be kept active. And, I would agree with him, of course. I'm a modern human. And I think this is true. Can you see my dog? I don't know if you can or not. So I think this is, well, the Buddha would for sure agree with this, because if you read the Buddha's biography, he tried eating very little. He became basically skin and bone, and he realized that he wasn't reaching enlightenment that way, so he started eating again. Let's see. So one point that's important in this chapter, and I think this is true for modern day practitioners, probably practitioners since the beginning of time, is this idea, which is presented in the Yoga Sutras, which he doesn't say the exact sutra number, but that's okay. So the sutras say stira sukham asanam, which stira means firm, fixed, steadfast, enduring, lasting, serene, calm, and composed. Sukha means delight, comfort, alleviation, and bliss, and asanam is the plural form of asana. So the idea of this is to find both to be firm in your posture as well as comfortable, right? So I often translate this myself as being like steady and finding that strength where you need to in the pose, right? So if you're, say, in Warrior 2, pretty much your entire body is activated, right? All the way from your tips of your toes to the tips of your fingers, through your torso, all of that is activated. But you can relax your face and you can release your shoulders down your back. So sort of finding this balance in a posture, which I do think is important, and that can translate to life as well, right? Like, where do you need steadiness, and then where can you find comfort? So that is pretty important. Is that the only thing I have highlighted here? It may be. Oh no. So he also goes on to talk about balance, right? So stira sukham, you're trying to find this balance. And he goes on later in the chapter, and he says that the ancient sages identified balance to be a key part of life. So he, throughout the chapter, has emphasized balance being in every layer of our being. But what are we supposed to balance, right? So, okay, we're learning, we're supposed to balance something. What are we supposed to balance? And he says that the answer lies in the three qualities of nature, which are called the gunas. So the three qualities must be balanced in your asana practice, in your body, mind, and soul. And roughly, they are translated as solidity, dynamism, and luminosity. So the Sanskrit words for the gunas are the tamas, rajas, and sattva, which tamas is mass or inertia, rajas is vibrancy or dynamism, and sattva is luminosity or the quality of light, right? So if you know anything about Ayurveda, these terms are used in Ayurveda as well. So if you're too tamasic, as it were, then you're too heavy. You can't move around. And I don't mean like, it could mean by weight, but not necessarily. You could be like mentally weighed down, right? Like, have you ever had a day where you're like, nope, not moving today. I'm not getting out of this bed. I'm just going to watch Netflix all day. That would mean you're in a tamasic state. So a rajas is where, vibrancy, dynamism. So you could be too rajasic. I don't know if I'm saying that right. So you could have too much of the rajas quality, right? And then you're all over the place, hyped up, right? And then ideally, at least in an Ayurvedic sense, you want to be sattvic, right? So you're like illuminating everything, and you have movement, but it comes sort of with ease. You're not hyped up, but you're not heavy either, right? You're sort of somewhere in the middle. So depending on which of these states you're normally in, you can do things to enhance the other qualities. So that's sort of how that works. And so these are some of the ideas that relate to the Yoga Sutras that he talks about in this chapter on asana. He also goes into some detail about specific asanas and different things, but he goes beyond that as well, talking about this in a more holistic way. But essentially that's sort of what he's saying in that chapter. So then the third chapter is titled Vitality, the energy body, prana, right? So obviously here he does connect the pranamaya kosha with pranayama, because that makes sense. They have the same root word, dealing with the same topics. So here he says pranayama is usually translated as breath, yet this is only one of its manifestations. According to the Upanishads, it is the principle of life and consciousness. It equates with the soul, or Atman. And in the classical non-dual Shaiva Tantra practice, prana is that life force energy that connects all living beings, right? Because no matter if you're human, if you're my sweet toy poodle, or you're this plant over here, you're breathing. You're taking in oxygen we're all taking in oxygen and carbon dioxide. We're releasing the carbon dioxide. Plant over here is keeping it for me. Isn't that nice? We're sharing. It's caring. Cheesy, I know. Okay. Anyway, so it is the breath of life of all beings in the universe. They are born through it and live by it, and when they die, their individual breath dissolves into the cosmic breath. It is the most essential, real, and present feature of every moment of our lives, and yet it remains the most mysterious. It is yoga's job, and especially pranayama's, to enter into the heart of this mystery. So he says prana is the form of breath. Prana in the form of breath is the starting point. The suffix ayama means stretch, extension, expansion, length, breath, regulation, prolongation, restraint, and control. So put in its simplest form, therefore, pranayama means the prolongation and restraint of the breath. So you want to prolong your inhales and your exhales, and you want to hold them at the top end and the bottom end. Yes. So he says to generate prana, you must cultivate the extension, expansion, control, and restraint of your normal breath. So he goes on to say, the Annamaya Kosha So he goes on to say that the Pranamaya Kosha deals with the psychological and organic body. And so he does go on to talk about how personally, like I mentioned at the beginning when he went to Pune, he was not experienced in pranayama. And so he said he didn't really start practicing pranayama until 1944, after he had been teaching yoga asana for several years. And he says the analogy of the production of energy through hydroelectric power may prove helpful. So stagnant water can create no energy, which means if you're not breathing, you're dead. If you're breathing normally, there is some flow and you can produce just enough energy for the requirements of the moment. But there is no surplus to be invested in other projects. It is only by the technique of pranayama, which regulates channels and in retention of breath, dam the flow, all the better to harness and extract the inherent power, that we produce sufficient energy to vitalize the whole system. We must live fully before we die. We must generate sufficient energy to realize our full potential. The journey to our infinite core of being is arduous. Only pranic energy can take us there. So, most of us in our normal lives, really, we breathe fairly shallow. And if you take up a pranayama practice, which you should get a teacher for that, it starts to deepen your breathing. And I mean, sometimes you're coached through this in terms of a meditation class or sometimes in an asana class as well. But you want to breathe deeper inhales and exhales. And this not only can help deepen your breathing, which is really good for your body as a whole, but being able to control your breathing and elongate it in some way can also help calm your nervous system, which can be great in certain instances. So he goes on later in the chapter and he talks about vrittis, which are thoughts that surface in the mind. And so I find this really interesting. Let me see if I can find it where I have it. Maybe I typed over it. Also a possibility. Oh yeah, here we are. The vrittis are also sometimes called the fluctuations of the mind, and there are 5 types. Now, what I found very interesting, as I was looking back over his 5 types, I was like, this is not the normal 5 types. So he has, and I may pronounce this wrong, Maitri, which is cultivation of friendliness towards those who are happy. Karuna, which is cultivation of compassion towards those who are in sorrow. Mudita, which is cultivation of joy towards those who are virtuous. And Upeksha, which is cultivation of indifferences or neutrality towards those who are full of vice. However, the normal terms that you'll hear for vritti are paramana, which is right knowledge, a state in which the mind reflects reality. Viparya, oh my gosh, I cannot speak. Viparyaya, which is misconception, a state when the mind makes a wrong judgment, which in time is replaced by right knowledge. Vilkapa, which is imagination or feeling, which refers to the understanding of a real situation, though words do not directly relate to the situation. Nidra, which is deep sleep, the state of the mind that exists when one is asleep. And Smriti, which is memory, that which is stored in the mind. So, there you go. There's 2 different ways of interpreting the vrittis, right? But you want to, let me say this on the next page. No, he says it somewhere in here, but I don't know, is it the second? Is it 1.2 of the Yoga Sutras? It's something like that. It's in the first 5 sutras. It says that the point of yoga is to still the fluctuations of the mind. So, I mean, vrittis in that sentence. So that is in the Yoga Sutras, the stated point of this whole system is to still the fluctuations of the mind, to stop these vrittis, or to calm them, make them more passive, like a calm sea versus a turbulent one. He also talks about pratyahara in this chapter. So again, pratyahara is the withdrawal of the senses. So it's interesting that he talks about this here, but that's what he does. So that's interesting. And that is mostly what he addresses in this chapter. So he says here, though asana practice takes one's mind deep inside the body, it is in pranayama that one begins to learn the withdrawal of the senses and the mind from external engagement. By this, awareness and energy are invested within. This is the opposite of what happens when you are having a hectic day at the office. And so he says the fifth petal of yoga, pratyahara, is a continuation of the intensification of this process, leading to mastery of mind and senses. And he says, I say that for a beginner, exertion through sweat is greater than penetration to one's core, and that in pranayama, penetration gathers momentum. I call it a hinge. In the same way, pratyahara continues to be a hinge or pivotal movement in yoga's path, when the energy created by the practice need to be matched and balanced by the prudence of detachment. So practice generates a centrifugal force, a spinning and expanding energy. So that's how he's sort of correlating these two things. So in chapter 4, it's called Clarity, the Mental Body, Manas. And in this chapter, he combines both the Mano Maya Kosha, the mental emotional body, and Vijnana Maya Kosha, the wisdom body. He combines these two things into this chapter. So he says here, Patanjali in his Yoga Sutras chose to make the workings of mind and consciousness, both in success and in failure, the central theme of yoga philosophy and practice. In fact, from the yogi's standpoint, practice and philosophy are inseparable. Patanjali's first sutra says, now I'm going to present the disciplined code of ethics. Oh my gosh. He wrote this in the longest way possible. Okay, he says, quote, now I'm going to present the disciplined code of ethical conduct, which is yoga, end quote. So in other words, yoga is something that you do. So what do you do? The second sutra tells us yoga is the process of stealing the movements and fluctuations of the mind that disturb our consciousness. So he's translating yoga as something that you do, however, in a variety, both from various teachers, various sources, both during my yoga teacher training and outside of that. Yoga, yes, obviously, is a practice that you do. It is also a state that you can be in. So it says everything we do in yoga is concerned with achieving this incredibly difficult task. If we achieve it, Patanjali says, the goal and the fruit of yoga will be within our grasp. So that's very exciting. That's good stuff. So he goes on to say that yoga identifies three constituent parts of our consciousness, which are called chitta. They are mind, which is called manas, ego or self with a small s, which is called ahamkara, and intelligence, which is called buddhi. So he says the mind is the outer layer of consciousness. Its nature is fickleness, unsteadiness, and instability to make productive choices. It cannot decide between good or bad, right or wrong, correct or incorrect. This is the role of intelligence, which is the inner layer. Ahamkara, or ego, is the innermost layer of consciousness. Literally, ahamkara means I shape, and it presents itself as our personalities and assumes the identity of the true self. It is the part of us that hankers after anything that attaches. So whichever layer of consciousness is active expands, causing the others to retract. Yoga describes the relationship between these parts and their relative proportion to each other. And then yoga explains how they retract when they encounter the world, which of course they do all the time. Yoga points out how we generally react to the outside world by forming entrenched patterns of behavior that doom us to relive the same events endlessly, though in superficial varieties of form and combination. So he goes on to talk about the mind and how it's our human computer. And then he gets to a discussion of samskara, which is, I'm pretty sure it's discussed in the Yoga Sutras. So these are mental impressions, recollections, or psychological imprints, right? So when something imprints itself on our brain, it causes us to have specific feelings, or, this is what causes something to trigger us. And it causes you to form habits, right? Most of the time to try to stay away from the negative, but not always. So he says the practice of yoga is about reducing the size of the subliminal mounds and setting us free from these and other fluctuations or waves in our consciousness, meaning the samskara. So everybody aspires to be free. No one wants to be manipulated by unseen forces, but effectively the banks of samskara in the dark depths of the unconscious do just that. A stimuli from the conscious surface travels rapidly down through the levels of a lake. They encounter uncharted banks of sediment that cause secondary waves of thought. These in turn stimulate in a way that is beyond our comprehension or control. Behavior that is both reactive and inappropriate, or others might call inappropriate. Sometimes it might be the only thing you can do. So he goes on to say, we diminish the size of negative mounds and turn them into positive samskara, such as if you were previously a smoker, you would say, I am a smoker. But then you become a non-smoker. So you say, I am a non-smoker. Or I am good-natured. Or I am equitable. And then you build up banks of good nature, openness, non-smoking, or whatever you want. So you have to deal with these samskara, you have to work through them, right? And in modern terms, this might include therapy. Love therapy. So yoga never forgets the end purpose is not just the removal of bad samskara. We also have to cultivate good deeds to build up good samskara. Of course, we first have to weed out bad, but the yogic compass always returns to the notion of emancipation. So the samskara are pretty interesting, and I feel like, am I crazy? It's always a possibility that I'm crazy. Keep that in mind. as we're here, hanging out together. Am I insane? More than likely the answer is yes to that. Okay, perfect. No, I'm not insane. Okay, so let's continue. So we have talked about samskara. So later in this chapter, he goes on to say the yogic tools that will facilitate this leg of our journey are the 6th and 7th petals of yoga: concentration or dharana, and meditation, dhyana. So this he is also including in the, he's including with the layers of Manomaya Kosha and Vijnanamaya Kosha. So then he goes on to talk about Vijnanamaya Kosha. See, I knew what I was doing. And then I lost it. No surprise there. So he goes on to start talking about consciousness and understanding consciousness. And he says, and he's talking about correcting our misperceptions, and like we often look back and say, oh, I shouldn't have said that, or I shouldn't have done that, and we feel guilty and regret. Yet in the principal world, we put a lot of effort into avoiding this situation. He says, yet most people look back on their lives seeing them as being littered with mistakes. We say, quote, if only I had known then what I know now, end quote. But what we know now doesn't seem to stop us from making more mistakes. The yogic blueprint says that right knowledge and erroneous knowledge are two modifications or states of consciousness. By the practice of yoga, we can lessen or eradicate misperceptions and wrong knowledge and gain accurate perceptions and right knowledge. I'm not talking about changing our opinions, although this may happen, but rather about abandoning them altogether. An opinion is yesterday's right or wrong. Knowledge warmed up and researched for today's situation. So opinions are rooted in the past, and our examinations of memory have shown us that the past can be a minefield. The practitioner of yoga is always trying to be in the present, which is where reality is, and so perfect present awareness in a given situation is his goal, right? So when we encounter certain situations, we think back to the past and we think we rightly know about the current situation because of a similar situation we've encountered in the past, right? But that may not be the case. This particular situation may be different. For instance, say you have one of those fun customer service jobs. So usually to have a pleasant day at your customer service job, not only do you need pleasant customers, but you need all of your fellow coworkers to show up. Am I right? I'm right. So, you may have a coworker call out and really they just want to go party with their friends. And you know this, so it makes you very angry. So then, say they call out again or somebody else calls out, And because of this previous experience, you think they're calling out just to have fun. And then maybe you yell at them or something. And then you find out, no, they had a serious situation. There was a car accident. They, had something happened to a family member, like something they really needed to call out for, right? And so this is where it's important to be in the present moment and not think you know what's going on because of something from the past. This is my example. Isn't that nice? So, he goes on to say, according to yoga philosophy, correct knowledge is based on 3 kinds of proof: direct perception, correct deduction, and testimony from an authoritative sacred scripture or wise, experienced people. Now, we need some discernment for this, right? So, direct perception, that's you seeing it firsthand, knowing it firsthand. But this implies you're also going to correctly deduce what's going on. And then, testimony from an authoritative sacred scripture or wise, experienced people, this can be a little, difficult, right? So we may think we're looking at an authoritative sacred scripture, and perhaps we are, but if you take any text, and just for instance, I'll say the Yoga Sutra because that will keep it neutral. I personally own like 4 or 5, well, that's not true. In book form, I have like 3 translations of the Yoga Sutras. I have another translation on my Kindle, and I have 1 or 2 more translations as audiobooks. So all of these translations translate the Sanskrit differently. Now that doesn't mean, just because they're using different words doesn't mean they're not all sort of getting at the same thing. However, one of these translations, which it's noted in the title of the book, it's translated through a tantric lens. And so this one probably deviates the most from the other writings. And some of them, I have one where they're intentionally updating it to make it more relevant for people today, right? So they don't all say the exact same thing. So somebody else could come through with a translation, and if you've not seen any other translations and you can't read Sanskrit at all, they could totally write out a lie, and you wouldn't know. And you would think, oh, well, I bought this book, a publishing company published it, it must be accurate, right? And so just because sometimes we're presented with things as being accurate, they're not necessarily. So, he goes on to say, initially, individual perception should be checked by logic and reason, and then seen to correspond to traditional wisdom. So we are all familiar with this process. In the example of buying a house, we see the house and form an impression. This is our direct perception, right? You go, you look at the house. We then make an assessment based on what we learned about the house. And hopefully have correct deduction. The surveyor is our experienced sage, and his technical reference books are the scriptures. In this way, 3 kinds of proof ideally corroborate one another, right? And so through this process, if you have a direct experience, and then it can be, correct deductions can be made, and then these things are backed up by wise scriptures or wise individuals who, in this case, we're talking about a spiritual path or further down that same path that you're on, then you're probably on the right path. All right, so. Am I crazy? And so, oh my gosh, I'm hilarious. I confused myself earlier before I started this presentation. Did I? Did I not? I feel like I did. Oh, I did. So earlier I said that Manomaya Kosha and Vijnanamaya Kosha were in the same chapter. I was incorrect. I was speaking out of turn. I don't know why I thought that even before I started recording this, but they're in separate chapters. So in the chapter Wisdom, the Intellectual Body, Vijnanamaya Kosha, here is where Iyengar discusses the yamas and the niyamas in a little bit further detail. He also goes on to talk about something. And here he does mention what are known as the 5 afflictions or the kleshas, which taint every layer of our being except the pristine soul itself. However, he doesn't go into detail about that until the next chapter, so we'll come back to that momentarily. He also talks about conscience in this chapter. So he says intelligence can be largely self-policing because it has the ability to initiate action and the ability to factor in consequences of these actions. A conscious effort to observe and identify these defects in ourselves rather than in others pays dividends. Such self-examination forms an integral part of the study and education of self, or svadhyaya, which is the 4th segment of the ethical code of the niyamas. So the function of independent arbiter, the witness of the witness, as it were, is fulfilled by conscience. This is the face of the lens of consciousness that faces the soul. It is less likely to be tainted by contact with the world than the outward facing of the lenses, which is in contact through the senses with the world about us. When this facet of consciousness, which we will call in English conscience, is flawless, reflecting only the light of the soul, it is known in Sanskrit as the organ of virtue. So he goes on to talk about a little bit more about that. And then he comes into a discussion about dharana, or concentration. And he says, because dharana is so easy to translate, we often overlook or dismiss its importance. Paying attention in yogic terms is not concentration. True concentration is an unbroken thread of awareness. Yoga is about how the will, working with intelligence and the self-reflective consciousness, can free us from the inevitability of the wavering mind and outwardly directed senses. And so dharana is truly something that needs to be practiced today. Most of us cannot concentrate for any length of time on anything, right? Like, I teach college, and I have a few students who, yes, will put their phone in their purse or their backpack or whatever and not look at it for the entirety of class. But that is not most students. Most of them cannot, stay focused on, if I'm lecturing, on that lecture the entire time. And in our modern world, we're expected to multitask, right? So concentrating is very difficult. So through a dharana practice, what we generally refer to as a meditation practice for most of us, especially when you're starting out meditating, really you're practicing dharana. This is highly important. And even as someone who was in school for a very long time, like 11 years I spent in college and graduate school, like sometimes I could really focus in if I was really interested in what I was doing or studying. My degrees are in art and art history, so if I was highly involved in working on an art project, I might be able to stay focused on that for a long period of time. And sometimes even with like research or writing, I could stay at it for a really long time. But then whenever I started doing meditations here in the West, dharana as it really is, I could actually concentrate a lot better. So now I can like sit and do something and my phone can even like vibrate or ding, letting me know that something magical has happened. I've either gotten a text message or, somebody liked my Instagram post or whatever, and I won't even stop and look at it. I'll just keep working on what it is I'm working on. So there are some real benefits to that, not just in terms of like, oh, well, that's nice, you could be more productive at work. But it really can help you in your daily life also, because there's other things you need to get done. If the more you can stay focused on them, the faster they can be finished, and you can move on to something you'd rather be doing. I don't necessarily recommend that for work, because then they'll just give you more work to do. Not to be a pessimist about work, but yes. So, meditation, or what we refer to as meditation, very beneficial. And then, his discussion of dharana is a little over a page and a half. Then he goes on to talk about meditation, which he talks about for a little bit longer. So he says meditation is the stilling of the movements of consciousness, and it brings the turbulent sea to a state of flat calm. And he goes on to say that yogic meditation is performed alone, not in groups, which if you go to a meditation class, it's going to be in a group, it's fine. It is not a lonely activity, but aloneness is the illuminating moon that can lead to the ultimate and transcendent aloneness, not to confuse aloneness with loneliness. I think, maybe. I think that especially, with a dharana practice, like I said, we often equate that to meditation. I think it's very beneficial to do it in a group, because sometimes someone else who's there may fall asleep and start snoring. And that'll kind of like jolt you at first, like you may be doing really well, you're like concentrating. But that snoring, it can interrupt your concentration, or something else may happen that interrupts your concentration. And so then, at least in terms of like a mindfulness practice, like the act of mindfulness is noticing that you've become distracted and bringing your concentration back. So it's very beneficial to be in a group setting, in my opinion. Or like even after the pandemic started and things moved online, sometimes I would be in a meditation class and the teacher's pet, their dog, might start barking. And I've been on the other end of that. I've had my dog start barking during classes, and you like freak out because you're like, oh no, you're disturbing the students, right? But really it's actually beneficial because it can bring them back. They'll notice that they're distracted and they can bring their focus back to their anchor. So it's actually really useful, in my opinion. So he goes on to say, as Patanjali wrote, yoga chitta vritti nirodha, which is the exact sutra that I was trying to think of earlier. So yoga is the cannot say this word cessation of the fluctuations of consciousness. As I said, that dharana purifies intelligence, the still mind is by definition pure. So yes, this is one of the major points or purposes of yoga according to Patanjali and the Yoga Sutras. All right. So, then chapter 6 is bliss, the divine body, Ananda or Anandamaya Kosha. And he says, our inward journey has now taken us to the innermost core of our being, to the bliss body or divine body, Anandamaya Kosha, that resides within us all, where our souls live and where we can glimpse the universal oneness that embraces us all. So, he goes on to say the vision of our divinity forces us to return once again to the nature of our humanity. Before we can understand the universal soul, we must understand our own. And before we understand our soul, we must explore all that eclipses our true selves, especially the wily I, capital I, that takes on 1,000 disguises to distract us. So he goes on, who am I? Is a fundamental question that has always existed in people's minds. And this is a fundamental question of most Indian philosophy or all Indian philosophy. So, traditionally it may have been answered to some extent by referring to one's role or primary function in society, right? So, you might say, I'm a wife, I'm a parent, I'm a professor, right? And this is, especially in our modern world, this is how we identify. Who am I? We say, a lot of time, that's how we identify ourselves. You can identify yourselves in other ways also, right? Depending on what qualities you see in yourself, I guess you could say. But the deeper implication of the question have always been present. In any case, no one is a mother or businessman or school teacher all the time, all their lives. These are temporary states. Even if you say, I am a man or a woman, it is incomplete. Formally, you are a child, and besides, does sexual identity have any importance when you're asleep? I have some major thoughts about this. I agree. Or I guess he didn't answer the question. No, your sexual identity has 0 importance when you're asleep. None of your identities has a single importance while you're asleep. So, what we're really saying is, I am I, which is not very helpful. But the I we are referring to that, no. So by I, we are referring to that bit of us that seems to be at the center of our perceptions, our actions, our feelings, our thoughts, and our memories. It is often called the ego-based self or egoic self. But if all we can say is I am I, and everyone else is saying the same thing, then logically we must all be the same, which visibly and palpably we are not. But the important point is that all of these qualities we are listing are external to the I. In other words, the I identifies itself by conjoining with its surroundings. So clearly, I leapfrog one answer to the who am I question. It is, I am a human being. For this to be of value, one has to ask the follow-up question, what then is a human being? This is exactly what yoga does. So the starting point of yogic inquiry, the basic questions underpinning all yogic practice is simple. What are we? Even the asana itself is an inquiry. Asking in each asana, who am I? Through the asana, the practitioner throws out all extraneous parts until only the soul is left. So then he goes on to say our lack of certainty is, according to yoga, of itself and by its very nature toxic. Yoga identifies the very deepest roots of all illness as being the sorrow and pain we undergo because we lived in ignorance of Purusa, or the universal soul. Being ignorant of our true self, we identify only with aspects of the natural world, which is in a state of flux. And so here he goes on to talk about the 5 afflictions, or the klesha, which include ignorance, egoism, attachment, aversion, and fear of death. So he says there are 5 afflictions. They're natural, innate, and they afflict us all. The first of them is, in effect, the father of the other 4. If you cannot overcome it, you will have turned night into day. Whereas certain schools of thought, especially in the West, make an amalgam of all of these forces of evil and call it the devil, yogic thought begs to differ. It too makes an amalgam of all the forces that lead men to perform evil and pervasive deeds. The difference is that Western thought ascribes the attributes of intelligence to evil. The devil is a clever devil, sophisticated in the arts of corruption and possessing an independent consciousness separate from and antithetical to the aims of man and God. This is a situation of unending conflict between 2 intelligent and sentient forces, one good and the other evil. The devil of yoga is not intelligent. He is ignorant. In fact, he is ignorance itself. We often think that ignorance means you don't know the capital of Albania, for example. What yoga means by ignorance can perhaps best be translated as nescience, which simply means not knowing. So to a Hindu, the archenemy is a state of not knowing. What do we know when we are ignorant? We don't know anything. So the answer is this. You don't know what is real or what is not real. You don't know what is enduring and what is perishable. You don't know who you are and who you are not. Your whole world is upside down, and because you take the artifacts in your living room to be more real than the unity that connects us all, more real than the relations and obligations that unite us all, perceiving the links and associations that bind the cosmos into a seamless whole, it is the object of yoga's journey of discovery. Again, perceiving the links and associations that bind the cosmos in a seamless whole is the object of yoga's journey of discovery. So you have to get beyond these afflictions, right? So you've got to gain knowledge. You've got to let go of your ego. You've got to let go of your attachments to possessions, thoughts, emotions. You've got to let go of your aversions, right? Like, I have an aversion to getting my blood drawn. I find it hurts. I don't like it. However, I'm getting better. I take some deep breaths. I'll let them take my blood. And fear of death. And I think, in one sense, that could be the easiest, but it's also the hardest because, yes, while we all may have some belief to what happens to us after we die, I don't know, somehow those beliefs aren't strong enough to make most of us not scared to die. And it's, like, you don't know how you're going to die. It could be painful or not. My great aunt, she passed away at the age of 96 on her front porch swing. Just passed away of old age. So she didn't suffer in any way. She just let go. How beautiful, right? And so, sure, we could be scared of having a painful death, but you're also scared of dying because you won't be in this reality. The only thing that you've ever known, or at least can remember having ever known. So, yeah, you've got to get past these kleshas, which is also part of yoga. Now, there is a last chapter to this book called Living in Freedom, which I'm not going to get into. I'm going to leave that. I'm going to leave that for you so that you can pick up Iyengar's Light on Life and you can read it for yourself to potentially help you along your yoga journey. I think it's a lovely text in that it gives you insight into several systems through which you can approach yoga, as there are many, many, many. I thought about getting into one discussion. I said, no, that's for later. But yeah, I think it's really great, especially anybody, if you go to any yoga class, the yoga teacher, if they've been trained in the West, they're going to know about the Yoga Sutras. That's a text that you get introduced to, and that is the main philosophical point that you learn, or philosophical school. And a lot of teachers deal with the Koshas. That is also something that is very well known, as the Vedantic tradition is the most well-known Hindu tradition in the West, or at least in the United States. So the Kosha system is also very familiar to many yoga teachers and yoga practitioners. So I think, reading this book, getting some insight about Iyengar is fantastic. So pick yourself up a copy. I personally got this copy at a used bookstore that we have here in Dallas-Fort Worth called Half Price Books. So you might find one there. You can order it online, go to your local bookstore, and give it a read. So that is what I've got for this episode. And I think next week I'm going to talk about the yamas and niyamas further, as I put out a question on Instagram about what subjects people would like me to talk about in the future. And someone suggested the yamas and niyamas. So I'm going to dig deeper into that, which is really interesting because obviously I've listened to a variety of translations, but also I've been in some discussions about it where things have been proposed in an interesting way. So we will get into that next week. Thank you so much for joining me for this episode of the podcast. I hope you learned something, and I will leave you with Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. May peace be with you throughout the rest of your day and week, and I look forward to connecting with you on Instagram, possibly in Patreon, and seeing you again or hearing you again next week. Bye.